Everyone loves to brag and drive home when they're right about something. I'm victim of it too. I'm guilty as charged. But I also much rather prefer having a little bit of self-deprecating fun, having some humility, and poking fun at myself when I get something completely wrong. And that's what this video is going to be. My 5 all-time worst player predictions that I have made in my life as a New York Mets fan. Now, number 5, we are coming in with one that I made when I was young and dumb and still learning about how sports worked, and that was being excited when the team signed Tom Glavin. Now, the reason why I was excited was because I just figured, hey, at least we don't have to watch him beat our ass with the Braves every single year anymore. Glavin overall was kind of washed, not terrible, but the reason why his contract and his time with the Mets sticks out as being one of the worst runs ever for the team in a lot of fans' minds is because of the bookend starts. In his first one, and I remember this because I was in 5th grade, and my teacher, who was a huge sports fan, he came over to me around 2 o'clock, about an hour left in the school day, and said, well, don't worry about watching the replay of this one. And I looked at him weird, and he goes like, Glavin already gave up 5 runs, and they are getting blown out. I thought he was kidding until I went home and saw that the game was like 13-1 at that point. I think the final score was 15-2 for that game. Only thing worse than the start to his Mets tenure was the end of his Mets tenure. You know, that fateful day in 07 when he started the last game of the year right after John Maine shoved to keep the Mets playoff chances alive against the Marlins, who really had almost nothing to play for. They were basically Hanley, Ramirez, and company at that point in time. But hey, they enjoyed having 2 years in a row ending the Mets season, and Glavin was the key responsible party for the first one, getting absolutely shelled, having his worst outing of his Met career and possibly his entire career in a must-win game. Now, just a quick side note here for San Diego Studios. You know, the company that makes MLB The Show and uses real players' likeness and legends. Tom Glavin is a Brave. He is not a Met. Met fans do not like Tom Glavin. Stop making his best cards Mets. On to number 4 now, and this one kind of stings because it had to happen in the moment, but in hindsight, it was horrible. That is extending Yoenis Cespedes. Cespedes was lightning in a bottle when he first came over the Mets in the trade deadline in 2015. There was the big debate between who should they get, Carlos Gomez, Justin Upton, Yoenis Cespedes. Everyone knows about the whole Gomez trade that fell through at Wilmer Flores, him crying on the field. Zach Wheeler was going to be a part of that too, and it is crazy to think how much better the Mets turned out being that trade failed and then got Cespedes instead. You were looking at no Zach Wheeler and no more Wilmer Flores versus just losing out on Michael Fulmer, who basically has done nothing since that trade. So Cespedes comes here and he kills it. He has arguably one of the 5 best second halves a player's ever had after a trade acquisition. The only one I can really think of off the top of my head that was better statistically was Manny Ramirez to the Dodgers, but Yo killed it. He did so good, it forced the Wilpons, who didn't like to spend money at that time, to break open the bank and give him one of the 5 largest contracts in Mets history at that point in time. And then the rest is history from there. He just barely played. He was always hurt. It was a disaster. We all know about the whole incident on his ranch with the boar pit and all that stuff and the horses. Who actually knows what really happened with there when he broke his leg not playing? But yeah, they gave him a huge contract and he barely played, but nothing compared to the next 3 that we're going to name. And sliding in at number 3 is the only one of these that isn't an actual signing. It was deciding not to re-sign Zach Wheeler. And I was all for it in the moment when it happened because Zach to that point was injury prone. The thing is though, there's 2 factors that made it a horrible decision for the Mets not to re-sign him. One is that it's impossible to get really good starting pitching under $20 million a year now. Zach is right around that $20 million a year number, and he's been Cy Young level pitcher since he signed that deal. He put it together in his last year with the Mets in the second half. There was a big debate amongst fans in the front office, I'm sure. Is it going to be this moving forward, or is it going to be more consistency from him? Turns out it was consistency. He figured out how to pitch. He's been great since going there. And at $20 million a year, that is a steal. The Mets just had to pay Justin Verlander $43 million a year. They also had to pay Max Scherzer $43 million a year last year. And Jacob deGrom just signed for $5,185/$6,222, depending on how that goes down with the Rangers. Pitching is ridiculously expensive to the tune that Taijuan Walker is making a couple of million less a year to be the Phillies' probable 4th starter than Zach Wheeler is to be their ace. That is how much the contracts have gotten out of control, and that is why Brody Van Wagen, making the decision to not bring back Zach Wheeler because of the Wilpons budget is a terrible move in Mets free agent history. And speaking of terrible moves in Mets free agent history, number 2, and the most embarrassing one for me on this list, being pumped for them signing Michael Kadire. And we have to stay in this mindset. It was a $100 million payroll was a blessing for about a decade with this team. And in the middle of that stretch, opened the offseason early by signing Michael Kadire. And I was so pumped for it because I thought it was going to be one of 5 moves that they were going to make that offseason that were going to be impactful moves. I thought Kadire was just going to be a platoon guy. Turns out with the way the budget was, he was going to be an everyday player, and he was nowhere near that player for a couple of years prior to that. He could still hit lefties, but that was it. But they had him out there every day, and he was one of the worst Mets I've ever seen get more than 200 games played. It was a shame, and it's just embarrassing to say that I was 100% pumped when they got him. And the only caveat to that to make me look slightly better is that I thought they were getting him to be the left fielder against lefties only and a pinch hitter against lefties. They got him to be a left fielder against everyone, and that was never going to work, especially when it was the biggest move of the offseason, not one of a handful of moves that they needed to make. And the number 1 spot, this goes without any debate. I really can't think of anything worse than this in the history of the Mets, especially when you're just talking about signing or not extending, not talking about trades. And that number 1 spot is bringing in Jason Bay. I was shocked how bad he was. He was really good for the Pirates in a pitcher-friendly park. He was great for the Red Sox in a hitter-friendly park. I thought he would be fine with the Mets. He was a perennial all-star at left field. I loved him on Pittsburgh. I used to use him in the video games all the time growing up. I just was always drawn to Jason Bay. I don't know why. I was so happy when the Mets signed him, and it was the furthest thing from good when he was here. And honestly, it was just, you felt terrible for him. Everything the way it happened. His knees were bad. The Great Wall of Flushing, Bay got absolutely neutered by that wall. He lost all of his power. He couldn't get the ball out of the yard in Citi Field. His knees were shot. He had concussion history. He got another concussion with the Mets. It really ended any kind of a chance that he had. The whole thing was a disaster. You just felt so terrible for him the whole time. It hurt to boo him because of how good of a guy he seemed to be and how awful he was. And you knew he wanted to help and he was trying to do everything. I think the perfect summation of his career with the Mets was the one game against the Nationals where he got caught looking on a pitch that was a full 2+ feet off the plate. And that was the perfect summary for me for Jason Bay, because in that moment, in that bat, he takes ball far, should have kept a rally going. He does everything right, and he still winds up striking out. That was just Jason Bay with the Mets in a nutshell. So there are my 5 worst signing predictions of all time for the Mets. They have a very special place in my heart. Hopefully this list never has to get updated. Hopefully there's only honorable mentions down the line, because these 5 were brutal.